who the chair and vice chair are and get the website updated as well.
Okay. And are you okay with that, Dave?
Yes.
The motion? Okay. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Okay, next item. Discussion on building codes and related items. Do you have something specific on this, Clayton?
Just like the city, no, we do not. We plan to have a recurring item on the agendas moving through the rest of 2026 for this agenda item to just discuss implementation of the codes. If we have any new updated information on other municipalities that are implementing the new codes, and as a standing update for our energy compliance tools. I have not heard from NPPL yet, but I also didn't anticipate to hear for another week or two. They anticipated end of March for the initial release of our region-specific comp check. So hopefully that's still on track, but I do not have any updates for the committee yet.
Okay. Okay. There's nothing else on those building codes. We can move to item 4. Discussion on the emergency housing and Clayton sent out a proposed code change. Right over it, Clayton.
Yes, sir. We'll give just a second for presentation to come on. Take this opportunity to thank Juan for helping us out today, meeting. And excellent. So the presentation today is very short, brief. I just want to highlight that this is in response to the Resolution 24067 declaring an emergency for housing and homelessness. And then the next slide really just covers the scope of what we're trying to target here. We're looking at how to get small shelter sleeping spaces approvable in the code, and the basic parameters that we're looking at are 200 square foot max gross footprint, no less than 70 square feet for space for each occupant. But if there were multiple occupants, we did bake in some language consistent with care facilities that requires 50 square feet per occupant. So that's only if they're sharing the space. Now that being said, let's back up just one. There is some logic to the numbers that we're proposing here. The 200 square feet is consistent with what we're seeing for structures that do not require a permit that are manufactured by a number of different producers. And so this facilitates targeting the manufacturing of units that are already being produced, and how existing units such as storage sheds that are already being constructed below this threshold might be easily modified for quick production with the intent that we can respond rapidly to an emerging situation, and existing manufacturers might be able to cater their current products. So that's part of the 200 square feet rule.
Just a question, do they understand that once you occupy it, it requires a permit?
That would definitely be an important part of the messaging that we will incorporate as we move forward. And I agree, that is a common misunderstanding that any structure under 200 square feet does not require a permit, and that is not what the code says. Detached accessory structures such as storage and playhouses that are less than 200 square feet are exempt from building permit, and that's specifically what the code says. So this is not that condition, but we also, again, want to cater to companies and entities that can respond with products that they've already got designed, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And also our research has indicated that the majority of the nonprofits that are facilitating these types of uses ultimately only have one occupant per building, per unit. That is what we have heard as a general rule of thumb, that it takes extra effort on their part to manage having multiple people in a single structure. But we also acknowledge that what we're also trying to target is not just the chronically unhoused, but also the temporarily unhoused. So what happens in the case of a catastrophic emergency, such as an earthquake or something where we have a large population that are displaced as a result of some local emergency. And in those conditions, we will likely see families being displaced. And so this allowance here for the 200 square feet also considers that, that could facilitate a family of four. Because if each occupant requires 50 square feet per occupant, then that still facilitates that. So we're trying to be as flexible as possible.
So, but it's 70 plus 50 plus 50 plus 50,
It's 70 square feet minimum
right?
or 50 square feet per occupant in a shared condition. So, and that's, again, this is draft language. We are seeking your input, seeking your feedback. So in many care facilities, it is 70 plus 50.
Right.
But, is that also necessary in this condition? Or could we say the minimum is 70, but when you have a shared space, it's 50 per occupant, which would also support ultimately 100 square foot structure for two people.
Versus
we're
120,
exactly.
which is how the living.
The difficulty would be once we get up to that higher threshold of 4 occupants.
Yeah, then you need 220 square feet.
Right, we wouldn't be able to get four, a family of 4 in a 200 square foot unit.
Especially if you had a couple with 2 little kids, 200 square feet might be plenty, especially for like an emergency condition.
And obviously,
Survivable with 2 kids.
There are some codes that do 25 per square feet for children. And they parse it down for that.
so that would also be great information if we could identify other regions that have specifics. We'd be open to consider those and investigate what makes the most sense as we engage not only designers and builders, but also the nonprofits that are operating these type of facilities. And then 2 more basic criteria. It's got to be thermally controlled. We need heating and cooling in these, especially in the desert. We're not intending to make hot boxes. They're not air conditioned. They need to be safe for people to sleep in.
Does that include ventilation as well, minimum outside air? So you have to actually say that as well.
That's
Because some of the really tiny things, like if they try to do a fuel wall air conditioner, I don't know if that's coming from fresh air. And, the new buildings are built tight.
It probably doesn't, but with it only being, 100 to 200 square feet, I don't know, is every time you open the door, you get more than enough ventilation.
So I'm really glad you brought that up. Both points are essential to this conversation. So when we were looking at the requirements for natural light and natural ventilation, it's typically handled through a window, an operable window. But do we need an operable window in these conditions? Because as Mr. Cawthorn brought up, you open the door once, you've got all the fresh air you need.
Right.
And so,
For sleeping through 9 or 10 hours.
That would be the question is I don't know
In
how
a tight building.
I don't know how tight these would be. So that's the other question. Yeah.
Don't you have worse if
So, and if you put an operable window, does it need to be egress as well?
no. So here, and this is all tied to that same conversation. So What we did on this draft was not require an emergency escape rescue opening with the assumption that the door serves that purpose. So if there's a full-size door, then that would be their egress. But we do have a condition where potentially there's an interior partition. And so one of the responses that we got back from our stakeholder group was that, well, if you put a partition in, do you have an emergency escape rescue opening on both sides? So we've, as this draft morphs, this is not the latest version, I'll tell you that, because it's continuously being updated. So we are looking at, you know, the emergency escape rescue opening when there are interior partitions, but you know, panning hardware is only required above certain quantities of occupant loads. So at this point, we're just looking at a single door serving that purpose. But, you know, the ventilation over long periods of time, I think is, you know, definitely needs to be considered and potentially discussed further.
Yeah, because your through the wall air conditioner typically does not count for outside air.
Heat
Well, it's a heat
tax.
tax. Heat tax can.
But a mini split wouldn't either,
Right.
especially a mini split, actually.
Right.
Most of the codes do refer to ventilation being a required means, and I think you could just take care of it with an operable window. You could even have an operable window. You know, like, that's your operable thing, so I would just make it sure that there's. And the problem with all those other codes is that they say adequate ventilation. They don't say anything beyond that, and that obviously is frustrating for about everybody in this room. And so, you know, I think if you just say operable window, takes
Well,
care of it.
So the natural ventilation, this is Ken, the natural ventilation only requires an opening to be operable. It doesn't, so the door could actually be your source of natural ventilation. You know, the door can remain cracked or for security, they may want to close it, but you know.
You need a screen to keep bugs out too.
Right.
Well,
And then buildings keep getting more and more expensive.
Right.
screen, but I would, yeah.
So.
And it's an interesting dilemma
Right.
to have this conversation because, you know, we also want to make sure that we're not needlessly wasting energy. So if we have an operable window for fresh air and are leaving it cracked, but the air conditioner's on, you know,
Right.
are we being good stewards of our energy in that sense?
What is 429.2.12, energy conservation? Maximum energy rating index of 57. Or prescriptive requirements of the IECC. So the energy rating, I'm not familiar with that. Is that going to require a certain amount of tightness of construction and all that? That would mean, I think you got it means of application.
Well, there's issues with condensation. That a lot of people have mold, with vapor, through these things. So that's one of the design issues, one of the problems that we deal with.
Your door gap and for water heater.
Well, that's in my ventilation, that's something that needs to be addressed.
So
You get four people, 200 square feet, and we're shaking outside, they're slave for 8 to 10 hours. So potentially be a problem.
There are issues with doors with this population as well, and so I think, you know, having them and using them. So I would just do that with
and
solve it all.
I can't speak from experience, but I imagine that there is also value to having locks on the doors so folks can feel secure inside. So, you know, there's probably a few conditions where they're comfortable leaving the door cracked while they're sleeping. You know, so we're again trying to cater to all the scenarios.
No, but if you put an operable window, it's small,
You're done.
and it's secure, basically, yeah.
And then, as far as the, energy code, yeah, so the text that we're pulling from right now is intended to use existing language. That we're not, completely reinventing the wheel. We're basing it on industry standards in code that already is established. So the ERI, energy rating index number that was in there, is out of the IRC. So where energy ratings are used, that's the target for the 2018 IRC. So that was where that number came from. But we also wanted to be flexible to say, well, if you can insulate a residential building using prescriptive values, why couldn't you do that here? The challenge there is the prescriptive value for roof insulation is R38.
Yeah.
So when we're dealing with a 120 square foot structure, 10 to 12 inches of roof insulation might seem a little overkill. So there's the option, right?
There's also the issue of mixing insulation on the outside of the roof deck, which causes problems for these constructions as well. It's a specialty.
So our target there is the greatest amount of flexibility of design.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't really too concerned with the energy saving side, but rather if that rule would require the building to be constructed so tight that it would not breathe by itself. So you've got to have some other means of ventilation. That was the context of my question.
And I will say that there's nothing in the current draft that would require a blower door test to verify air change. And that was not our intent.
And I look at this too, like, let's face it, trailers, motorhomes, all that are usually 1 or 2 inch of foam, and that's it. So, and which I would think would be plenty.
Could there be a prescriptive minimum like that in here for non-insulation requirement? Would that make more sense than trying to tie it back to dwelling units in the IRC or IECC, which is going to be doing a full-blown permanent building expected to last for decades?
Yeah.
My personal approach would be to find a way to identify prescriptive methods. This entire thing is intended to be a prescriptive approach to these types of structures. So I think that would be valuable for insulation as well. We just struggled targeting what that prescriptive value was based on justification. You heard the 1 inch of foam, but also where would that come from? We need something to justify a comparative.
What about an older edition of the energy codes?
Do the homing project, the pallet structures, do those have insulation?
They do.
And what is that just a 1 inch insulation board with fiber?
They're using
on
a
each
whole,
side?
they're using a whole value for the structure itself. Again, kind of like the ERI approach, where they're looking at the total insulated value of the whole structure combined, not necessarily the individual components.
And even the operable window, I don't know that requiring that to be I think you could just require, I don't think you would put a U value or a shade coefficient value with that, because I think that'd be too restrictive for such a little tiny window. It's just say it's just to be an operable window of, whatever the smallest is.
I mean, I think because you're adding even just cooling to this, because by code, we don't have to cool, correct? We just have to heat and fresh air.
We do, thanks to our most recent amendment, we require coolants.
But just that you're actually asking for that. I feel like the energy conservation would limit installations potentially. And then if you're asking for heating and cooling, then that will provide a thermal comfort potentially more energy than what you may want to do, but I mean, how much more energy in the big scheme of things for these little units? I feel like the energy conservation stuff is nice, but it's necessary.
You could be trading off the energy, extra energy in the units versus all the energy it takes to manage unhoused populations that are all over the place. Require resources to deal with those.
Yeah, just,
I would agree, give it a break on monolith insulation, such, and maybe.
I would just say, and that's why I'm thinking, like I said, an RV is gonna have 1 or 2 inches. 1 inch is probably, it's smaller than any RV, so the volume is so little that 1 inch, I would think would be fine. And because you can't get the smallest through the wall unit or the smallest either window unit or the smallest
Heat tax, 1,000 feet.
right. Yeah, and I think that's the smallest window one I've ever seen is like 3,000 or 4,000, maybe 5,000. But that's about it. And that's gonna be more than enough.
Mini splits are like 9,000.
Yeah. So I just don't see if you're gonna put that in there, that there's any.
You're not gonna have a problem hitting maintaining the temperature. It's just when they may use a little bit more energy,
Yeah.
but overall, you've got such a small building anyway.
Right.
It'd be better off to ensure they're not running it and it's empty.
So you could just say a minimum R5, which is 1 inch, right?
Well, that'd be a better way to do it is the R value, and then the designers can decide what exact material to use.
Right.
Rather specifying.
Just a minimum R5.
Well, let me ask you this,
Walls and
do the RV manufacturers have standards they must meet?
That's a good question. I don't know.
They do, but I don't know about energy standards. I have not seen an energy standard for RVs.
That's a really good question. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, those are the state have requirements to
would you,
manufacture.
It's like 4 inch in the roof.
Just a manufactured housing. That has to meet the state requirements, which is still has all the same codes. It might be an older
They're
code.
like the 2009.
Yeah, it is the older codes, but whatever the state.
But even then, it would have been.
Right.
but would it be so bad to have a building that's, let's say, built out of studs, with studs and has plywood on it, and then maybe some sort of skin that reflects the sun without any insulation and have that heated and cooled? Would it be that bad to do that?
It's such a small building.
Right, so I just wonder,
It's really, really cold. It might take more.
for sure. No, I hear,
Electric heat, it's pretty inefficient, expensive.
And then I would also challenge that, while the heat or cooling loss may be minimal in each unit, we're also talking about a multitude of units. So it would be the cumulative effect of all of these, that would actually raise the concern for energy loss.
drop.
Well, I mean, we've done the cost benefit. We've done the cost benefit analysis on single family residence. We have no such data on this kind of housing. I mean, following the IOC and those energy requirements seems very excessive with this type of structure. But I don't know what to hang my hat on as far as a standard.
I mean, it's a little bit of an issue of, like Seattle, where they don't even want to look at it because they don't, I mean, the agenda behind that is cost and ability to produce these facilities. So that's the viewpoint that I'm looking at from the energy conservation. Like, is this a necessary thing that could potentially limit the installations? If we're already providing heating and cooling, then that right there is a limit. right? On how you produce these things.
So I would think that the heating and cooling are gonna be way more costly than a 1/2 inch foam board just slapped in between the studs.
It's not just cost, but it's just doing it, whatever, you know, or limiting the construction, let's say. So that's just where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Could you just say shall be insulated? Not say to what level or whatever, just put the requirement out. And then every project will make a decision of how much insulation they put in, but everybody will have to put something in. And how low can you go and still have it be commercially available insulation? And maybe it's open enough so if somebody's got a clever idea, like you said, a reflective material instead of whatever, they can make the argument, building official, that, hey, we're trying to meet this with this new way. I don't know if that would be enough.
Right. And wood has a value insulation.
Yeah.
You know, so
And you can provide shelter from the thermal elements, could be a way of phrasing it.
At some point of organization running the whole encampment, when they get hellacious electric bills after they built the first one, they may say, well, when we build the next one, we need to address that.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good way to do it. That way it just kind of opens the door for however they want to go about it.
Well, when they typically do these, they do multiple units that are identical. Right. So in negotiating on insulation, it's not a big deal. I mean, you wouldn't want to do a heavy custom house, you could go and negotiate the insulation. But if you're doing 20 units, then it may be possible, it's not too onerous. But I'm going to pay.
I saw this in the paper the other day. I just thought, oh, we're talking about that. So, yeah. So this was interesting.
Article on Star Village.
Right.
Yeah.
Which we may end up putting the units on there. Extensive discussion.
So, unless there's additional conversation on the thermal, I'll just move on to the fire separation distance. So one of the tasks that was put before us is how to create the standard without requiring sprinklers. That is one of the major limiting factors that we have experienced with every submittal that's come in. And so trying to identify what level of safety is reasonable to exempt them for sprinklers. And this current approach is a combination of the maximum area limit of 200 square feet and the minimum fire separation distance of 10 feet. So that's to say that none of these structures may be closer than 10 feet from each other or other structures. And that is specifically intended to create a level of compartmentalization for fire safety to exempt the requirement for sprinklers.
So have you talked to the fire department?
We have talked to the fire department and we're having ongoing conversations. I actually have another conversation with the fire marshal in about an hour.
And
Because they love fire.
They do,
and does that,
for good reason.
how do you take into account overhangs? For this,
As it relates to the maximum area.
as it relates to separation distance.
So we would currently rely on the amendments in the IRC or the IBC as it relates to fire separation distance, and projections that extend into the fire separation distance are required to be fire graded.
Let's say you just eliminate the overhang.
Well, no, you don't. You want to shade, all of our designs have overhangs, at the door for just being there and also for shade protection of our openings. So we have clear stories.
So how would that apply to Ken's article there, where you got a structure under a canopy? You measure to the canopy of the structure?
So Ken's article identifies tents underneath the shade structure. Neither of those would be required to comply with the provisions that we're writing for microcodes. So, but, you know, the question is, where is the fire separation measured? And I'm gonna say the exterior limits of the structure. So if we're talking about, you know, overhangs, that overhang is extending, you know, potentially into the fire separation distance. But the requirements for tents and membrane structures, like what's in Ken's article, are regulated separately from what we're proposing for micro cabins.
But you're asking a really good question because, like, on our site, we're using just standard IBC for separation of like the units from a canopy structure that's being used for public assembly. But I could see some people saying, let's build a shade structure over these to provide better thermal and solar and everything. And then it would be interesting to see how that would be interpreted in code, right?
And you're putting sprinklers on the shade structure.
Yeah, I think that would be a unique condition.
Anyway,
But you mentioned tents in this document.
We do, as a separate item from micro cabins. So just as a highlight of the way that the draft is currently structured, we've got a tentative numbering schema here that breaks out 429.2 has subsections. You know, 429.2.1, 0.2.2, so on and so forth. So that section is for the overall campus. And then if you notice, when we move into the requirements for micro cabins, there again, where we have subsections of 429.3, then breaks out into 3.1, so on and so forth. And then we've got mole sleeping units toward the end in 429.4 with two separate subsections there. So tents and membrane structures are already addressed in the IBC and our local amendments. So we didn't add a lot of extra language under this provision simply because it's already covered or under the provisions for tents and membrane structures.
You're making this more confusing, not less confusing.
you know what code's supposed to do.
No, that's what the footnotes are supposed to be.
So I was noticing I said the smoke, you want smoke alarms in each of these. Under 310.7.
Yeah,
I have a comment.
and that's super standard. I mean, but if they're problematic, Sacramento, you know, they're always going off. And there's always emergency people coming to the site.
Such a small area, if they smoke inside,
Exactly.
it
And
goes
that,
off.
that goes with the outdoor shade comment. Like they're starting to require places that provide shelter for smoking outside so that people don't smoke inside their units. So it's the smoke, everybody has smoke alarms, but they cause problems.
And I don't know that we will have much traction on a conversation to eliminate the need for smoke alarms if they are unsprinklered.
Right.
If they're non-sprinklered, you know, like residential buildings in the IBC require sprinklers and smoke detectors. So like, I'm not sure that we could get very far down the path of not requiring either.
I'm concerned about the interlocking requirement. I'm not sure about the technology to do that, if it's going to actually drive the necessity to put a fire alarm system in. Accommodate, and when you get beyond about a dozen separate standalone smoke alarms that have to be interlocked. The technology isn't there to do that. So I think it may be reaching too far, and given that you have a 10-foot separation already, couldn't it just be a smoke alarm that's local to each unit? And know where the interlocking comes.
For the feedback.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think it's just,
If you have a 200 square foot unit, the smoke alarm goes off in the unit,
if everybody will hear.
everybody's gonna hear it.
Right, right.
What within that unit.
No,
But if you're interlocked, what it's saying is it's interlocked to activate all the alarms in each micro cabinet space located in the same
Yeah, I think
home
that's-
campus.
Yeah,
That means if you have 25 cabinets, all
Everybody-
25 have the sound, and
yeah,
you're literally evacuating the whole site.
that'd be,
I will say that that was the intent. And again, we're trying to identify a path forward to exempt the need for sprinklers. So there's part of this is directly relative to how do we justify not sprinkling them when all residential structures in the IBC require sprinklers. So I will say that the language that we've proposed so far does not necessarily require hardwired, and it doesn't prohibit wireless, and that's intentional, right?
Agreed, but at some point, it doesn't become interconnected residential type smoke alarms. It has to still become a fire alarm system. So now you have, a central system that's costing thousands and thousands of dollars instead of a bunch of individual $40 units. I think the interlocking can be really, really difficult if you get beyond around a dozen units. So you're also saying they would not have to be hardwired, that they could just be battery. Maybe you should actually say that.
How many units do they typically do? Content?
I mean, there could be 50, there could be 100.
So that's full blown fire. alarms.
And then you get to the point, if you have 100 units, how spread out it is, you really need, if this one goes off, you really evacuate every single person. Given that you already have the 10-foot fire separation.
and these are so small, I would think that the people around it are gonna hear, right? Even though they're 10 feet apart, they're still.
So, I don't know, if they're right against a major roadway or something, there's gonna be a lot of traffic.
But
I will say, it's just anecdotal, but I believe that nearly every one of the unhomed that live in my neighborhood, my office neighborhood, they all smoke. I've seen, they're all smoking. So you're gonna have a lot of smokers.
Well, the other issue is you could get 50 cabins. All the smoke alarms go off. The fire department shows up, which one? Right?
So then you need, again, that comes back to needing a fire system, so you have an association to know where. But that's a really, really big cost, and it's not just a one-time hit. Fire alarm systems need a lot of maintenance. There are always something's going wrong, and every maintenance call is hundreds and hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, there's no way that Portland, Seattle, California, Massachusetts, Texas.
They don't use, but the smoke.
They put smoke alarms, there's smoke alarms and carbon monoxide.
They get, like I said, a lot of false alarms
Yes.
because everybody's smoking. You're smoking right at.
Well,
the-
there are rules at these facilities.
Okay.
That they try to enforce, and there's always somebody there managing. So it's just a problem.
That's why you have your porch, right? So that they can be outside.
Well, there are,
You understand.
Star Village has a smoking area, Sacramento has a smoking area. So there are, provisions that are made, but there's always exceptions. That's just the nature of the beast, right? Just, that's a management issue.
It's a problem.
So I don't think code's gonna fix it. See, your panel's not gonna stop people from smoking in the place, so you don't do it. Right?
They don't want to wake up your whole camp because one person's smoking, two, like. I don't have an answer to that one, Clayton.
Oh, I will say that I don't have answers to a lot of questions today. This is intended to expand the conversation and make sure that we're asking all the applicable questions as we develop. To that point, I would also like to just state that any code language that we are drafting right now is not, we are not intending to get this adopted into our amendments in the very near future. What we're trying to do right now is establish a baseline of safety so that we can start to approve some of the projects that are currently in the pipeline under the emergency declaration. We need a standard set of framework that the inspectors, the plan reviewers, everyone can agree on and point to so that we don't have folks applying different sets of rules. So that being said, let me just say that the draft language that we are producing will be temporary during the duration of the declaration that we currently have, with the potential to adopt permanent language at a later date.
Well, let me toss this out. What if you develop your site in clusters? So you have 10 units, but then maybe you have one, but the next only goes spring.
So I really appreciate that point. I want to circle back to something Bill said, where you might have 50 or 100 units. If there are 100 units, would all 100 units be sharing the same shared services as like restrooms and in cooking facilities? Or would they ultimately have multiple areas that are congregating separately? If you've got 100 units and they're all trying to use the same banquet restrooms, that could be problematic. So I can't help but wonder, if you've got a facility that's that large, if it would naturally be broken into separate campuses.
I can't remember what Sacramento has done with their large villages, but I wouldn't try to place restrictions on that. It's for me.
Some point you could have just it'd be inconvenient if the bathroom's too far away.
I think battery powered firearms. It's
So we should waive the requirement to go there. It's a can of
police hardware and firearm.
I could see, since they have electricity in them, that maybe you do want hardwired. That's not a terrible hardship to do that. But the battery could be a minimum. People don't off the record for it. I want to always say that.
So that being said, could we just move into the requirements for permanent wiring, permanent electricity as part of the next discussion, and any concerns that you might have identified with other electrical requirements?
You'll be really happy with me. I put together an exhibit here, which I'm welcome to hand out to people if you can read my chicken scratchings.
Well, I was a little confused on 429, 310. First of these sections. What code are these sections?
This
It's cool. It is one thing on the wall.
yeah,
Want me to go ahead?
please.
Yeah, so I started asking some questions then, try to go through these sort of in order, how they're written. But the 429.310.2, which is a 20 amp circuit. I'm just questioning whether it really has to be a 20 amp circuit for the receptacle, because we're prohibiting cooking in the units. You're already requiring permanent heating and cooling to be installed. So what will they be plugging in that uses that much power? So
Which also,
it's limiting.
which also is related to your 310.9 appliances, portable appliances shall not be utilized. What about these little tiny fridges? So those aren't allowed. Yeah, and what would be
But, you know, if they were allowed, they draw about 1 amp of current.
Right, right.
So that wouldn't really be, like, maybe you want to say, cooking or heating appliances or something of that nature.
Which you did, and you said that, yeah.
Somebody could still maybe want to have, you know, air dryers and electric, iron clothes, or, you know, somebody's got that stuff. Sure, but I mean, people use that in ordinary houses, 15 amp circuits. I'm just saying, I'm not sure it's required. Yeah, it would be a good idea. But if you're building 100, an interesting thing about construction cost is with the 15 amp and 14 gauge wire, you can use the back wire devices that you just plug in and they assemble quick and easy. When you go to 20 amp, you have to do the screw connections and also it takes more labor to do 20. So that's one issue.
Well, the question is, if we're, in fact, home builders using 15 amp circuits, why are we required this?
In a dwelling unit, 20 amp circuits are required in specific spots like kitchen countertop outlets and areas where it's expected that you're going to have high wattage appliances used. It seems like that's not intended to happen in these units. So that's why I made the comment. Second one was 429, 310.4 was talking about the receptacle having arc fault circuit interrupt. Well, if you go into the NEC, the requirement is not just in normal dwelling units or sleeping units or dormitories or any of the things that you actually have a sleeping is where you get the arc fault requirements. They require all outlets. And you have to look at the definition of an outlet. It does not mean a receptacle outlet. A light fixture, that's a lighting outlet that supplies the light fixture. If you have a permanently wired air conditioner, it's an outlet providing power to that. So NEC says AFCI for everything that's 120 volt on a 10, 15, or 20 amp circuit. So I think we shouldn't say here for receptacle outlets. And I'm beginning to think instead of micromanaging this, if we might be better off to just reference the electrical code for some things. Let's see, 429, 310.3. That says a dedicated branch circuit shall be provided. So if you literally interpret that, you only put one circuit in. Well, that takes away the freedom of the designer. If they want to put the cooling on one circuit, I think somebody should be able to make that decision. So I'd be better to maybe reword it slightly to just say, instead of the word A, just the capital D, dedicated branch circuit, S in parentheses, shall be provided to serve heating and cooling. People can design this if they want to. When we go to the 429, 310.4, a number of receptacles that does not meet that NEC 210.60 minimum requirements. So when we talked last time, we're thinking, well, it doesn't have to be built quite like a dwelling unit. But what we're building really is a sleeping unit. And there's a separate section in the electrical code for sleeping units, and it still essentially has the 12-foot spacing for receptacles. So, for example, if you looked at a 120 square foot unit that might be, say, 10 foot by 12 foot, and you had a 3-foot door in it, you would have 1 linear feet of wall. So you have to have it counts to 3.4 receptacles, should have 4. Now, if you figured this 120 building had, say, 2 occupants, then this proposal only required 2. Now, maybe it's reasonable to say we want to reduce construction costs and put fewer in. I just wanted to make sure we understood that everything in the NEC is where they're sleeping, it's pushing that same 12-foot.
This is Clayton. I just wanted to jump in before we change topics. I completely agree that we could benefit from just pointing to other sections of the code. My primary concern with identifying NEC code references as opposed to just spelling out what we expect, is the unintended consequences of those code expectations and where does it stop? Because what we're not trying to do is apply the same provisions for dwelling units and sleeping units to these because they don't meet the definition of either a dwelling unit or a sleeping unit. Definition of a sleeping unit requires sleeping space and either a kitchen or a bathroom. And we're looking at how to create sleeping spaces that don't contain plumbing, so they will by nature not meet the definition of a sleeping unit. And again, to try and keep construction costs down and everything down with the intent that this is not intended to be a dwelling unit, we're looking at how to avoid that regular spacing requirements.
I understood that as I was writing these comments, but I'm also looking at how the NEC has requirements for ground fault circuit interrupters, for arc fault circuit interrupters, for surge suppression, for disconnecting mains on buildings that are supplied by a feeder from some other service entrance. And it's all intermingled, but there's sort of a common thread that goes through part of that, which is, everything related to an R occupancy tends to go to the 12-foot spacing on receptacles for number required. And every example in the NEC where there's actually people sleeping, like a dormitory, which, an individual bedroom of a dormitory, a bathroom installed, they still want arc fault circuit interrupters. And now they put the requirements in the code that you now have to have surge protective device on power system when you're providing power to arc fault circuit interrupters, essentially. It doesn't say that in the code, but that's where it's required. And I think because those devices actually have electronics and they're subject to being damaged and then they function if the surge comes from the power system. I'm just saying it's just snowballing. When you start to say, well, we don't have to do all this stuff, and you're moving really, really far away from the NEC. So then the question becomes, well, what if something goes wrong?
What's the purpose of the 12-foot spacing?
To keep people from using extension cords. That's the fundamental reason.
Okay,
So
is that a problem in these units?
Probably would be, because if you designated that 120 square foot unit to have a single occupant, you would only need to install one receptacle outlet. And if you've got a 10-foot by 12-foot, you put it in one corner and somebody wants to use electricity in the other, they're going to put an extension cord.
Or they're gonna put a plug in with a 6-foot.
So, and basically the same issues that drive the 12-foot in the house. Right.
I think they could, once you're building this thing more like a real building, and it isn't just a cabin or a tent that somebody's camping out in, or, a portable thing. I guess in my head, once you built this thing on a foundation and make it strong enough and watertight enough and air conditioned and all that, I think the expectation of even the occupants is that it's got to have enough stuff in it. And there's so much direction in the NEC, or, the NEC rules essentially are intact all in the IRC if you don't want to pay attention to this stuff. But IRC doesn't apply, so that's why I'm citing NEC. I'm just pointing out where the discrepancies are.
Was it a big issue to put a few extra receptacles in these units?
Everything you do adds cost. That's the issue. And if you're building 50 on a site,
Yeah, but it's always cost versus benefit. Is the extra cost justified for safety? That's the question.
I suspect that most people involved in the electrical business would say the cost is justified, but we've all had it built into us our whole careers, and these are minimum things for safety, minimum standard for safety. So if you don't have it, the implication is it isn't safe.
It's potentially worth it to just talk to people in Sacramento and see what has transpired. But if they've added receptacles over time,
What do they do there? Just one receptacle?
as far as I know, most of these places just have one receptacle. And it's mostly for charging phones.
So that's consistent with the conversations that we've had so far, is that the majority of the tenants that are, these are being catered to aren't bringing a lot of furniture,
They don't
but
have.
they're almost all bringing phones or tablets or laptops. And so, part of our conversation, we need to make sure that we are facilitating their real life needs, which are primarily based on all the information that we have, based on charging mobile devices, not plugging in lamps and alarm clocks.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that it's not needed or important. It's just that's the basis for where we built the draft so far.
I think we're gonna put in a quad.
To me, that would be a reasonable compromise. I'm not saying this because I'm advocating that we have to do all these things. I'm just making sure that everybody understands that what's being proposed is away from what the basic code requirements are. And then the second part of my little list I wrote was trying to think, well, what are all the things on NEC that probably would apply? And it gets to things like, well, how, so you have to have a main disconnect on that. You have to have an electric panel on the unit because it's fed from somewhere else. It has to have a main disconnect. You have to have at least 2 circuits, one for the lighting and receptacle, one for the air conditioning equipment. Could have more, but at least 2. So once you get to that threshold, even though you've only got 2 circuits, and they might be 2 15-amp circuits, you have to supply the thing with a 30-amp feeder, because that's in Article 225. Then you're going to have an arc fault circuit interrupter. They're already saying that is fine, we want it. So now you have to have surge, you should have surge suppression. If you go with a fancier air conditioner or need more circuits, like you're going to have 3 circuits or 4 circuits, then you've got to have at least a 60-amp feed. That panel on the outside of the building has to have a sign on it now that says emergency disconnect, because that's in code now. If you're putting in an air conditioning system that is like a split system, like a mini split, you have to put an outside receptacle in for the servicing of the mini split. Let's see. It's a separate building, so it's going to have a ground electrode system provided. If it's built like a modular building, has a metal frame or something, you have to bond to that metal frame. All the other residential type occupancies and other occupancies where there might be kids around require tamper resistant receptacles. So that's another thing that's done in all residential, so it's probably not a hardship at this point, but it's something required. I'm just saying there's a bunch of stuff that's in the electrical code. So I just wanted to put that on there. And maybe there's less to say other than maybe just, if you want to quantify to say that there has to be a minimum of 2 duplexes or 1 quad outlet. And maybe you could quantify that. But I think the other rules kind of come automatically if you just reference it's got to be for the NC. But if you're having residential designers that do their own electrical plans, they might not know all the detailed rules. And then they're going to get hammered in plan check and or by the inspector if it's built. So that would be the only reason to break it down to more rules here, just to maybe fend off those problems, which could speed up getting through the whole process. One more thing on the lighting outlet on the outside, you mentioned a wall-mounted control device. So the NEC does say, like, if it was a dwelling, if it's an outside outlet, you have to have it on the wall switch inside. If they just did like a motion device, that might not, have that wall switch.
This is Dave. So Dennis, like earlier, he's saying that micro cabins shall be designed by a registered designer. Couldn't that just say, hey, that person, that team is using their judgment?
Yeah.
This isn't like an IRC where we're gonna have technicians.
Well,
Well,
I
that's,
guess the question is, when you design these things, do you involve all of the engineering consultants?
I
Why does he?
Well,
I am, but I don't, I actually would prefer to remove the registered design professional requirement from this. It's necessary.
who typically does this, since you in that market? Is it restaurants or is it non-restaurants?
What's that?
Who typically does these kind of projects, restaurants or non-restaurants?
I don't know the answer to that, but, you know, like, let's say you're doing a project with a homing project who has these pallets that are like prefabricated. You just put them on the site and then you get portable johns and portable showers. And I mean, the only thing you need to really worry about is maybe site egress with lighting. Like there's no mechanical engineer involved. Right? Like, so it just, I think having a registered design professional is limiting, and I understand it. I mean, the Arizona State has its definition of when it's required, and I understand your I mean, like these sites usually end up having more than 20 people, and so therefore it should just I don't know if it's necessary. I don't know if that limits it to, you know, just, like, I could see doing this project without an electrical or without a mechanical engineer. But I would definitely need an electrical engineer,
Especially for the site.
for site,
For distribution.
yeah,
Just distribution.
we definitely need that.
if you were under 200 amps though, there are a lot of small architects that do their own
Yeah,
plans for everything, and they might just want to do it that way.
I think most of
There
this,
are a bunch of complexities here compared to doing a single family house, which is pretty formulaic with that.
Right.
And maybe those people would decide they need an engineer.
I think there is a potential that you would, yeah, you might not even need electrical, because, so I would remove that.
So this, Clayton, in response to that, I'd like to just point out again, kind of the philosophy and the approach of where we're going. The requirement for the registered design professional is specifically in the 429.3 for micro cabins. So it's saying the cabin itself needs to be designed by a registered design professional. It's not necessarily saying that the whole campus needs to be designed. And there's a reason for this, because several of the designs that we've seen do not have a permanent foundation. They're built on skids.
That's okay,
But,
right?
well, there's no prescriptive codes for how to build a structure on skids that does not have a prescriptive, a permanent foundation. So once we leave the realm of prescriptive construction for permanent foundations, all of that stuff, then we are in the realm of a design professional. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the approach was, well, you need a separate design professional for the electrical and a separate design professional for the engineering. It's, does the structure itself with its tie down lateral resistance and uplift resistance meet the design criteria of the IBC, which would be justified by an engineer or an architect. And the majority of the systems that we've seen so far already carry that. And so, you know, I would just say that the intent there was not necessarily to create more onerous requirements on, you know, the planning of these things. It's to actually give them the flexibility to avoid the prescriptive requirements of a permanent foundation and other criteria that we normally see with prescriptive approach.
So does the homing project have their thing approved by some structural engineer?
They've got a structural engineer on the cabin design itself.
Okay,
Well, I mean, the requirements are a little vague at this point, which should require some professional judgment by somebody. So in some sense, that kind of makes sense.
It's actually intended to create more flexibility rather than reducing the flexibility. But again, we're looking for feedback.
And my guess would be that these would probably be a model plan. So they didn't have to
do it
come up over and over and over.
That's a good point.
Be the site.
Well, I mean, are there people out there that aren't professionals that can do this kind of conditions?
Well, yes and no. So they go online and they get some software and they do the calculation. Whether they know what that means, that's another question. There's software online that do the engineering.
For overturning and gravity, you know, like,
Yeah, but that doesn't mean the person using it understands what they're doing.
You could query it. I can give you some.
Garbage in, garbage out.
then there's gonna be the city reviewing it, saying,
Right? Well,
This is Dave. I say in keeping with Clayton, we're not trying to create a whole bunch of new requirements. We already have the language of when design professional is involved, what he has to do.
well, single family house is pretty prescriptive.
But but
Very much so. Like you said, it doesn't have ballast or tie down. Talks about a permanent, you know, wood or concrete foundation.
And I would also just add, as it relates to the homing project, as a case example, the homing project's design would not meet the prescriptive requirements of the IRC. It wouldn't. It just, the materials and design don't meet prescriptive requirements. So if we're talking about a rapidly replicable design that can be essentially trucked in on a flatbed semi and assembled very, very rapidly for a mass event, right? We're back to this situation where there's a design associated with how these things can be pre-manufactured, off-site, quickly assembled, right? And still meet the basic safety criteria, you know, for a safe space.
At what point does the state get involved?
yeah, it's.
If it's a pre-manufactured house,
Office and manufactured housing.
right,
So what we're planning on doing is not putting the skin on any of it, the inside or the outside, and that gets site installed so that it can be reviewed by an inspector on site. And the skins will be cut and prepared in a factory, but they will be brought to the site and assembled after the electrical is in the framing. So
yeah, so you're not manufacturing the entire complete unit off-site and then trying.
we're manufacturing
All these components.
all off-site by volunteer labor, or whatever. But that you know, if something is built entirely in a factory, then that has to come from the city.
And I don't think they have any rules to address this kind of housing.
Not that I know of. I mean, they have rules for modular construction and offsite construction, but again, it's outside of the realm of.
Most of the common structures are built on site. It's a
Yes. And again, to that point, to the construction on site, you know, we've also heard a number of reports where volunteer labor is used, where, non-professionals are assembling it, but it's based on design criteria that has already been established by the restaurant. They're saying this is how you assemble it, right? And so it facilitates,
But that would be an improved set of plans also, right? So the question is, would you need a registrant to get one where you could submit an approved set of plans?
And according to the way this is written,
Yes. And we're just asking, that doesn't have to be yes or is there an intermediate? A line somewhere you cross it, you need a professional, and you don't cross it, you don't.
Well, I think the requirements have to be as prescriptive as they are on a single family house.
And maybe they can't be.
which is another challenge, right? Because
Maybe that's the answer.
we clearly don't fit into the confines of the IRC. There's been a lot of suggestions that we could use the IRC to assemble these, except they don't qualify. And so we would have to change the structure of the IRC to make them qualify. And that therein incurs other challenges. So by keeping them in the IBC, right, we're staying consistent with requirements for other buildings constructed on the IBC.
Listen to you, keeping with that, and the design professional, I'm suggesting that these are temporary dwellings, more or less. That we allow the designer to use a 10-year return period for any environmental. codes. Which would lessen some of the wind and potential ice. It'd be almost like a tech one.
And so off the cuff, I would support that. I agree. The only clarification that I think might be beneficial at this moment is the definition of R5. So what we propose to get them into the code is to create a new occupancy group called the R5. You'll see that in 310.6. So based on this structure, we're creating a new occupancy group. And by doing so, we're specifying what's included. And we say primarily permanent in nature there. And I just want to clarify that this is based on the time that the unit is occupied. So the building code establishes that if a dwelling or sleeping space is occupied for less than 30 days, it's considered temporary. If it's occupied for more than 30 days, it's considered permanent. So there, just so that you all know where this word permanent came from, it's with the assumption that at least some, if not all of these, may be occupied for greater than 30 days by the same individual.
I would guess that's pretty typical.
So just one more question. If you just say micro cabins shall be designed in accordance with chapter 16 to 26 of this code, what's wrong with that? Or did that inherently say that person has to be licensed?
So my immediate response is nothing that is designed according to chapters 16 through 26 of the IBC is currently allowed to be
Done by
permitted by a non-registered. So we're trying to just be consistent.
Is that true though? I mean, like, because the state of Arizona says what, 20 people, 20-foot span, 3,000 square feet.
We allow non-registrants on commercial facilities on a case-by-case basis. As a general rule of thumb, they're all required to have a design professional, but we do allow them in some conditions. They can justify that they stay within those confines. But then again, we also kick back a lot of plans that are prepared by non-registrants because the plans provided don't demonstrate that they have the capacity to prepare those plans. If we kick back a commercial application 3 times, It's because the plan clearly doesn't meet the requirements of the code, and they thereby demonstrated that they don't have the technical expertise to perform the design.
Yeah, I'm tending to go with the registered professional. I mean, people that do home design, small commercial, they don't know the why and wherefore as to why certain things are required. They don't know that there's a reason for the tall front spacing, such a thing. Or the requirement. That's the advantage the professional has, he understands why that's there. So when you get into these gray areas, you can make a good judgment. Or maybe the non-resident doesn't have that background to make that judgment call.
Oh, for the sake of time, I suggest we march forward because we will most likely continue this discussion on another date anyway. If we can get the screen advanced to the next screen, please. This slide of the presentation is really just identifying that the micro cabins are required to have supporting services. We've already, identified that the intent is to not contain plumbing or appliances, therefore restroom, showers, clothes washing are provided elsewhere outside of the micro cabins. Therefore, we cannot approve micro cabinets to be installed unless we have the supporting services directly adjacent on the same campus to provide those needs, those basic living needs.
Well, I think clothes washing could probably occur offsite. I don't think I would. And it's almost, this and the social services almost seem like zoning jurisdiction as opposed to building code jurisdiction. And I've seen it done both ways. Denver, California, Seattle. So I don't know, it's a larger discussion on these support services and how they're reviewed and approved. Is it a zoning issue? Is it a building code issue? And the types of them, because like cooking, and some sites, the meals are brought to the facility and they're doled out there. There's no cooking facility at the site at all.
Which you may not want to do, because if you start having it on the site, then you're kicking in the health department.
Well, but some people want it too. Yeah. Like, and they want the option. And so, and I know Primavera will be doing potentially washing of clothes elsewhere, not on site. I know that they want cooking facilities on site, but they also want the service to come. And what I've seen in the building code, in the specific building code sections, is for bathing and bathrooms. And that, that specifically is addressed, it needs to be at these sites. But it could be either hard or portable. Those are how those are called out. But I think if you start getting too specific on what these other things are, it's really a zoning issue. Building code.
I would tend to agree that it'd be the restrooms and bathing facilities are probably the core thing you have to have. Because everything related to the food, there's so many other options of what could be done. The same with laundry.
I think, what people do in the zoning codes, they say these things are provided. Like that food, that this is a managed facility. And that there could be a variety of social services that are provided, as well as necessities like food, clothing. So I'm getting that stuff out of this.
This is not saying food, it's just mentioning clothes wash. But again, there's laundromats all over the place. How do you get rid of the clothes washing?
Yeah, I think maybe you refer to both the food and the clothes washing, similar to the way it did for public transportation. That it shall be provided. How it's provided is up to,
I think that's something.
yeah.
Like you can't, you know,
You can't do this project unless it's managed. Right, that's zoning's the gatekeeper. If it's not managed, no.
Right.
And so,
Manage me like a 24-hour
yeah,
attending from some.
yeah, like, that it's something that's providing, you know, this list of social services, that there's security, that there's somebody there.
Yeah, you're right. It's not.
But that's the first step, that's the site entitlement, right? Like, are you gonna do that? No, sorry, you can't do it. Are you gonna do it? Yeah, let's move on to the building.
So for the building code requirement, the rest of the showers, it's really all we're concerned about. That's a health.
That's what I think, yes.
Can't do restrooms, also.
And they could be portable or they could be hard. You know? And I would like to see gray water somehow be brought into this for something so that potentially, if there is hard stuff, we have a good idea of what could be used, you know, on site as opposed to connecting to a sewer.
But we don't have a quorum.
No.
No, but we're not voting on anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're just discussing, right? Clint?
we might need to actually close the meeting though. Well, because, let's see, no. The meeting is ended. If we no longer have a quorum, we actually need to.
Okay.
Real quick though, just in response to that, because it's so fresh, I just want to point out that, first of all, 429.2.3 for clothes washing does identify clothes washing facilities or laundry service. And the same would be true for 429.4 cooking and dining. It says permanent provisions for cooking, ... or regular food delivery. So we are looking at how to incorporate some flexibility for different configurations.
That's right.
But also, I want to point back to the definitions of a dwelling unit versus a sleeping unit versus what we're trying to achieve with a micro cabin. Dwelling units and sleeping units have provisions for bathing, cooking, so on and so forth. That in that unit, that is, well, sleeping units don't. Right? Sleeping units might share cooking facilities
I don't mean
outside
cooking,
cooking.
but the bathroom.
Right.
Would be it.
But sleeping units aren't required to have a bathroom in them either. So I just want to point out that like, without that definition, right? If we don't meet the definition of a dwelling unit or a sleeping unit, but we are still trying to achieve basic living space, then we have to have external services. So I agree wholeheartedly on the bathing and shower. I think we might need a little bit more discussion on cooking at least. I could see your point for a laundromat not, being provided, but again, I want to point back to the intent of this code is to provide a response to the either temporarily or chronically unhoused and what needs those folks.
Like Bill said, though, is the fact that the zoning actually control that. And so from a building safety point, you just for buildings, you just need the actual micro cabin and you got the bathrooms that serve it. Is that all we have to do? You don't have to address the other, or maybe there's no harm in saying what you said in these two paragraphs because, yeah, it's giving options, but it doesn't sort of limit it to two options. I don't know if there's a third way it could be done.
Just playing devil's advocate, as a building official must do, especially when we're creating new code, I have to think of worst case scenario. And what we're trying to avoid, right, is somebody putting a bunch of micro cabins in the backyard and then not providing those people with access to the house or something like that, right? There are predatory developers.
That's where zoning.
landowners. But the building code provides minimum requirements for living needs. And so that's
Yeah, that's where
we're
it
trying to
happens, then code enforcement comes in and then they need it in the building code because that's the thing that we got.
that trigger to shut a facility down and say, you are not providing the minimum infrastructure for living needs.
That'd be a zoning violation. If it was the thing.
Well, it'd be a health and safety violation. I mean, I look at the zoning code as more political than health and safety.
Mark down the time, approximate. Yeah. Okay.
I
Because that's
here.
technically when the meeting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you use the term sleeping area. But it's not defined. Sleeping unit is defined in the fire.
So I'm glad you brought that up. In the definition for micro cabinet. So the second page at the top, it defines micro cabinet, and this says a single story detached living space. This has since been updated to remove the word living because it's not a living space, because it doesn't have all of the requirements for a living space. It is a single story sleeping space. And so, we're actually trying to target in on that term sleeping space as tied to the definition of a micro cabinet.
Okay, when you get to the section 429.3.8, you're talking about final partition between the sleeping areas. What's a sleeping area? You have two people in a 120 square foot cabin, you have two sleeping areas or one? And how's that different than a sleeping unit? I'm not clear on that. Kind of writing a whole new code for this.
Can I give you my list right now? Is that okay? I think homing is a weird word to use. You know, community or something, just because the homing project already has that term in their product. The travel distance of 500 feet, I would look into why that is being done. Like I know there's studies that may be large. Where there's exterior circulation that would,
It's based on the accessibility criteria.
okay. Fine. Access the, or reference the fire access lane. Ceiling heights aren't mentioned.
On the ceiling height, the minimum area definition says a minimum of 7 feet in any plane dimension, which would include a vertical.
Okay, that's good. Lofts. There are other codes that seem to take lofts quite seriously. I don't know if you want to open that door or not. And waste. I know that's a little bit like this clothes washing thing. Where does waste fit in all of this? Is it in zoning? Is it in building code? So this might be on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
So really appreciate all the feedback. This is incredibly valuable, and I really appreciate the dedication to, looking this over and providing.
There's only one code in the United States I think that's done that. Denver. Everyone else has, done this emergency thing, but Denver's they've actually codified theirs as an amendment to their IBC. So it's cool.
So are we done?
I know, yep, we adjourned several minutes ago.
How can we be done? We don't have a quorum.
As soon as Dave,
I started looking, I thought, makes only three of us.
Well, what I didn't realize is that someone's being done.